All right.
Hey Chris, welcome to the Optimizing Nutrition podcast. We started chatting a couple of hours ago. You popped up in our data-driven fasting finale with a whole bunch of really cool reflections about the whole process, and I thought, hey, it'd be fun to get him on to had a bit of a chat. So you've got an amazing, diverse background of interesting training and a whole bunch of things. You get in a lift. What do you tell people you do?
Yeah. It's a question I try not to ask people.
Because then they ask you back.
Well, yeah, that might be part of it. And also, I find, just to be realistic, I think you answer that question a little bit based on the audience, right? Like if I'm around a bunch of real estate people, I probably focus on the fact that I do a bunch of real estate. But obviously, that's one thing I do is real estate. Then I have the e-commerce business, Big Chill. I have my blog Upwarding, which talks about there's a wealth piece and then a health piece, and then I got my family. And then honestly, I usually just talk about whatever is exciting me the most. So recently, when people say, "What's exciting you?" I tell them about data-driven fasting.
Because it's your new favorite thing. Hey, cool.
My
Thanks,
new
man.
favorite thing. Yeah, exactly.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. So you had a background in Harvard and Stanford and worked at a bunch of investment firms, including Bridgewater with Ray Dalio. Did you actually work with Ray Dalio himself? Did you get close
Yeah.
to him?
Oh, well, so I wasn't there that long, but at the time I went, it was a small enough place, and just the way Ray manages, I did have quite a bit of intersection with him, more than I would have thought, given
Wow.
that he's obviously now this multi-billionaire. And I think, unfortunately, people who probably join now, there's a little bit of an echo. I don't know if you can hear that, but I think unfortunately people who join now are probably subject to less of his influence, as he's moved out. But I definitely was there in the prime of his thought process, and we all joined and got a little, probably the preview of the principles book that he wrote. And so yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
he's a real iconoclast, and I love people like that because they really make you think. So I learned a
Yeah. I
ton from
really enjoyed the Principles book and just his way of thinking and being completely data driven. And that's taken him to be the biggest. Bridgewater's the biggest hedge fund in the world with what is it,
him.
$25 billion or something
Oh,
crazy.
I
So
think it's even more than that now. Yeah. And
yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was over 100 billion now. I haven't looked recently, but
Wow.
he's really attracted a lot of assets, and it was completely data driven.
Yeah.
There's a quote I love, and I met another famous investor said to me once. He said, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." It's something that stuck with me because the numbers can't lie, and so you
Yeah.
really need to understand the numbers behind what you're doing, especially when they confuse you, and they
Yeah.
surprise you. So that's another thing I learned is like, oh, this is when stuff isn't making sense or seems a little bit odd. That's when your ears should perk up and really dig into it. So I'm sort of known for that. Even in my business now, I have obviously a smaller business. It's not $100 billion business, but our e-commerce company, I'm always the guy who's digging in the data and saying, do you know what happens when, we change a dealer here? And so I love Excel. I once calculated I spent more time in Excel than with my family. It's probably true.
I think I'm guilty of the same crime
Yeah,
over the last few years. It's
exactly.
crazy. We should circle back to that, but in the health space, you've got a health blog and you're a bit of a health nut, a Silicon Valley
Yeah.
health nerd. And on the finale call, you said, I know data-driven fasting seems to currently attract a whole bunch of middle-aged ladies who are on Facebook who are wanting to lose some weight and manage menopause and reverse their diabetes. But why isn't this more accessible to people in the Silicon Valley health hacker, biohacker nerd space? So yeah, what are your observations in terms of what that's seen as into and what they need, and how do they balance data and too much data and confirmation bias and the like? I'd just love
Right.
you to wrap on that and your thoughts there.
Sure. So out here in the Bay Area, the beautiful thing is everyone loves a new thing, right? Everyone loves a new trend. Everyone loves a new technology because everyone's looking for what's the next thing that's going to make my life better, right?
Mm.
All of us agree that our lives are better when we can pick up an iPhone and call a kid instead
Mm.
of, growing up when you knew it was $1 a minute on this day and 75 cents. I mean, technology makes things better, right? Like, let's
Yeah.
agree to that. And so there's just this relentless pursuit of making things better. And with that as a backdrop, I think, data-driven fasting fits in because in a way it's very new. But I think, I don't know if I've said this to you directly, but, as we've had exchanges, this is, I think, a way of balancing a lot of that data. A lot of numbers nerds out here, as you would expect, and a lot of people who want the next best thing, but it's a way of balancing that newness with something that's very ancient, which is being in touch with your hunger, right? Like, in a way, all this technology has distanced us from our instincts, right? And I remember I was, months ago, I was struggling with weight gain and, sort of a process that ended up leading me to data-driven fasting. And my son just said, "Dad, why don't you just eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full?" And in a way, that's where we've circled back, right? Like we're almost back to that. And so, that's my thoughts in terms of, so Silicon Valley, numbers, new thing, tech. And in a way, this is new, but it is along the trends of, look, fasting, I think a lot of people are finding it works for them, right? Lowering maybe carbohydrate. And there's some extreme things of that, managing your blood sugar. I see a lot of that trends here, people wearing CGMs who aren't diabetic. I'm one of them who wore one. And I think this is a way to rationalize all that. And you and I had talked about data and, this joke of, in God we trust, all others must bring data. But the problem a little bit with biohacking and with being a numbers person is that you can overwhelm yourself with data. You can let the data take the place of hunger. And you can start looking at a million things. And you and I had a related talk earlier today, but I think it's important to really distill down to what the most important thing is. And, sometimes it's like, one of the things I told somebody once, I said, look, if you only want to have one rule to lose weight, just go to bed a little bit hungry. But I think now my one rule after data-driven fasting is probably only eat when you're hungry. When you're truly physiologically hungry, not when you walk by something you want to eat. But, I think if everyone followed that rule, it would be a nice basic rule and it would cut out a lot of complication and maybe leave a lot of the analysis to something else. So that's a long answer to a short question.
Yeah, no, I'm fascinated by that whole area, and I was all in on the Dave Asprey biohacker nerd, and I had my heart rate variability monitor and tracking my heart rate every morning, and in with the bulletproof coffee and the tracking weight every day and everything I could stack on. I wanted more numbers, but as I've tried to inflict that on people with the masterclass and data-driven fasting and a bunch of things, I just realized that most people, even though they think they want more biometric data, they fry their brain. And what we're trying to do is use the minimum effective dose of data to retrain your habits and reconnect yourself with your physiological hunger. So to say, I think I'm hungry, let's validate that with my fuel gauge, which is my blood sugar, to understand if I really need to eat. So I think that's the really profound thing. I really pricked my ears up when you were chatting in the live earlier today, just to say this is a real spiritual experience that you think it's all about data, but it's really about understanding your physiological true hunger. So I thought that was just a really cool observation, that it brings data through your conscious brain to retrain your subconscious reptilian instinct, your amygdala, and then that has a flow and affect your emotions, and it brings it all together through the conscious brain that we think controls everything, but really our data doesn't control everything. Our conscious brain isn't really in control of when we eat and what we eat, as much as we try to kid ourselves. So yeah, I just thought you really grasped that and articulated it really well before too.
Yeah, it's one thing I think about a lot is that, particularly a lot of successful people who struggle with their weight, it can be a real source of psychic pain, right? The fact, especially if you're someone who's successful at a lot of things, the problem is the approach that got you here, right? That sort of like, I'm going to push harder, I'm going to fast for 30 hours, now 40, like this sort of more is better, right? Which gets people successful. And that's, what helps them in their careers. And like, we all think very linearly, right? Like if I just work harder, if I just work out more, if I just fast a little longer, if I just, and the thing is, it's like the solution turns out to be somewhat nonlinear. And there's also, so because we've had these failures, right? Like, so successful people, otherwise successful people who've put on weight and they're like, I can't get it off. And it's very frustrating. And it can kind of be a deep thing that they carry.
Mm.
And so there is an emotional piece to this, right? Like, there is a piece where it's like, how do you get calm about this and not make it the next thing to achieve and not obsessed about it? I mean, I'm obsessed about this in a philosophical way, but I would say I'm less obsessed with, the number on the scale. Like, I don't even think I've been putting it into the app. I went to the app. I was like, oh, I've been putting in my weight, and my weight's down. I lost 6 pounds or 7 pounds on this challenge, but
That's great.
but that's a byproduct of what's been a really cool experience in terms of how I'm talking to myself, right? Like, not beating myself up. I was surprised how much I was sort of really being hard on myself, right? Like, oh, I put on another couple of pounds, like, what am I doing wrong or whatever? And then just like, I thought
I'm
this
a failure. I need to go harder. I need to try harder.
Like now I'm going to push
at university
even harder.
to study all night, but
yeah,
it doesn't work with hunger.
No, it doesn't. And I think it's sort of what's cool about it, right? Like, let's take this as a new puzzle with a new set of dimensions and be like, and I have all kinds of like dietary restrictions and stuff. I sort of alluded to some of these, right? And so for me, I was just like, hey, how do I figure out this puzzle? How do I figure out a puzzle of like, still having dinner with my family at night, even though they eat later than I would like? And how do I figure out this puzzle of when I eat in the morning and what I eat, food that I can enjoy, not being too hungry, and kind of listening into that. And also just data can be calming, right? Data can overwhelm you. But if like a number doesn't lie, and if you just say, hey, look, I'm only going to eat below 85, it's kind of a non-negotiable, right? And like, you're not going to talk yourself out of it. You're just like, hey, and it's not that hard.
Yeah.
Right? Like, for me to get to 85, it's like not a big deal. Like, whatever. And whatever someone's trigger number is, I think that's helpful.
And you don't have to starve yourself for days on end. You just wait a little bit longer and you go, okay, I'm not really hungry. I don't really need to eat now. But when you do, it's like, I am actually hungry. That hunger signal is real. And before too long, you'd retrain that hunger, and you can trust your hunger signals and reacquaint yourself with your actual physical signals of hunger. So everything's become so externalized, and we're so non in touch with our body through the use of technology and data to an extent. And you've got some stuff on your blog about digital detox and dopamine fasting and the like. And the irony there was you're in Silicon Valley, where all the tech nerds are overdriving our dopamine signals, so we just completely lose touch with our physical realities. So it's interesting. So what are people in Silicon Valley chasing at the moment? What do they want more of, and why? And what's really the solution, do you think? A bit of a philosophical, open-ended question, but yeah.
So that I can answer that in so many ways. Let me answer it in terms of health. I mean, I feel like what I see a lot of here, right? Longevity is a big issue, right? And so the thing people are talking about now is not just lifespan, not that you live to 90, but when you're 85, can you roll on the ground and, pick up your grandkids, right? It's sort of the idea of health span and what gets us there. And I think it's getting us into discussions of, hey, do you treat diabetes when you get to diabetes, or do you treat it beforehand? And the health trends that I see, the ones that are related to data-driven fasting, they're the ones you probably see elsewhere. I mean, keto is still very big, obviously. I have major issues with keto, some which you touch on and some which, are intuitive ones. But, and also just the fact that I don't know a single person who didn't go off keto and gain about 20 pounds when they did, right? So it doesn't seem to work.
Not long term anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So keto is really big, and then intermittent fasting is big. But I think a lot of people get frustrated by intermittent fasting for a bunch of reasons, right? Because you are purposely ignoring signals, and then the other thing, your hunger signals in some cases. And then the other thing that happens is this idea of, let me just keep fasting longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. And you can tell by the comments in the Facebook group that doesn't seem to work, right? Like that's sort of a path to failure, because at some point it runs out. So Yeah, from a health perspective, to summarize, keto, intermittent fasting, and then the general theme of why are people biohacking? I would just say it's health span,
Mm,
um, which correlates to everything: stress reduction, and everyone here is meditating and all that kind of stuff.
mm. So they're all trying to digital detox and dopamine detox after getting everybody else hooked on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter
Yeah,
and everything else, which is a
yeah.
crazy world.
It's
Yeah.
additive too. The one thing that and I do talk. You mentioned this dopamine fasting that I mentioned in my blog.
Mm,
It does seem like a lot of us are answering in an additive form. Like,
mm,
what can I add to my day to be healthier, right?
mm.
And so I would say, as you know, I'm a fan of like, what can I subtract? Like, how do I
Yeah.
subtract complexity? What's the one thing? But
Yeah.
it's like I have this like this device does triggers this vagus nerve, and then I have another device triggers vagus nerve. This like you can it's death by addition because you can't be training your health 18 hours a day either. So
And now I'm all stressed out about my aura ring and my binaural beats and my
yeah.
CGM all at once, and how do I manage them? And well, I've got to charge them all. And so,
Yeah,
yeah,
and I forgot my Aura ring, so now I don't know my heart rate, and I don't know how long I slept, and
how
Strava
am I
didn't.
going to survive if I don't know my heart rate?
Yeah, there's this app called Strava, and someone
Yep.
made a funny joke. They're like, if you go on a run and you don't, that whole thing, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody, did it happen? So it's like, if you go on a run, you didn't record it on Strava, did you
It
actually
didn't
run?
happen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, because
I
everyone's
love
so
it.
into recording their runs.
Strava's so great.
Yeah.
So, how did you find you used the CGM with data-driven fasting? What are the pros and cons of
Yeah.
CGMs? I mean, definitely we can use CGMs with data-driven fasting, but some people get overwhelmed and confused with too much data and go, okay, I
Mhm.
sneezed, I got a bit stressed, I had 2 drops of stevia and my blood sugar went up. Is that going to make me fat? And they just have all these questions that sometimes are a little bit too much and too overwhelming. So the simple glucometer can be ideal in a lot of ways, but it still works if you've got a CGM and can afford that.
Yeah. So again, I don't know if I mentioned this to you. Everyone who I'm recommending to get a CGM, I'm saying to them, don't use it for 2 weeks. Like,
Mm,
actually do the process of pricking your finger for 2 weeks. And the reason is what you want to do. So I always, when I prick and I put it on the thing, right before I say, what do I think my blood
mm,
glucose is, right? Because what I'm
mm,
trying to do is train myself to
mm,
be predictive, right? It's
mm,
like being able to walk outside and tell the temperature. Like, if you just did that every day for a year, you'd probably get pretty good at it. And so
mm.
what I've explained to my friends who, will be joining data driven fasting,
That's so cool.
is I said, I know you just got this, whatever, freestyle or Dexcom, but do the work of a couple of weeks of actually pricking your finger,
Yep.
looking, predicting and doing that, because I think you don't get that intuition if you have a CGM.
Mm,
You have so much data that you can look at it and you're going to know, like, hey, I did some calculations. Like, I know where I'm going to be in a few hours
mm.
with pretty good accuracy if I'm not eating, right? I lose about 3 to 4 points of blood sugar an hour. Like, and it's almost like you're doing everything relative, whereas you want to know that absolute number. So I think just a glucometer is a pretty good way of doing it. And this last week, that's all I did, because you do the Dexcom 10 days at a time. And I've enjoyed not having to obsess about the data.
Mm.
The plus side, though, is I think particularly if you want to answer a specific question, right? Like, let's say you want to answer a question like, how do I react to a high carb, high protein,
Mm.
low fat, or high fat, high protein, low carb? Like, if you want to compare those
Mm.
two and your reaction to them, seeing that curve and where it peaks and when it peaks, I think can be very instructive. And so
Yep.
instead of having to prick your finger 10 times over the course of 3 hours to get that data, I think having that can be helpful.
Mm.
It also helped me because, in data driven fasting, we're generally testing around meals and food. A big part of what I do is exercise, and so
Mm.
understanding how exercise influenced it. I wouldn't have done that during exercise, but it was very
Yep.
helpful to see the curves on exercise and what exercise can do, and more importantly, what it can't do. Like, you can't have
Mm.
10 pancakes and burn it off. Like, there's just math, right? And it's
What,
nice to see that.
what did you learn about fueling for your swims and your biking from the data from watching your blood
Yeah.
sugars?
About fueling or about what it did to my blood sugar?
Oh, I mean both. I mean, how do you fuel for a ride or a long swim
Yeah.
to make sure you get enough glucose on board, or maybe?
Yeah. I've been surprised how little pre-feeding I need to do. And I don't know if that's because I've typically trained in the morning when I haven't
Mm,
eaten in a while. But for me, having a little bit of food before training, and I mean a little bit, like
mm,
maybe 15 grams of carbs is
yep.
probably all it takes for me to not feel crappy
Mm,
um, during a hard workout. So the first thing I learned is that you really don't need that much
mm,
food. I was kind of surprised how little it was. That was a personal experience. Um, and then the other is there is a wild difference between aerobic and anaerobic activity. Okay. So aerobic, very clearly, and especially cold water swimming, which I mentioned in the Facebook group, cold water swimming in particular, or walking quickly. I mean, not,
yep.
moseying, but reasonably quick walk. That aerobic exercise, which you would do at, let's say, 180 beats per minute minus your age, that target level heart rate is extremely effective for bringing down your blood sugar,
Mm,
like extremely effective.
mm,
Um, but if you go and do an intense, there's a class here called F45 or Orange
yep.
Theory, but really intense workouts, my blood sugar actually went up and stayed up for
Mm,
quite a while.
mm,
Those workouts have their place, but they don't serve to bring down your blood sugar
yeah.
for a bunch of really good, biological reasons, right? Like
Yeah.
there are a lot of good reasons why your body does that. But I would just say, knowing that aerobic point,
Yep.
right, to the extent we're all tracking our data, which for me, it's 135 beats per minute. And when I go for that, it's just a different
Wow.
workout, right? Don't try to do a workout where you're bouncing around between those because you're neither fish nor fowl. Like either choose
Yeah.
to do, today when I ran, I did my once a week really intense run. But yesterday on the Peloton, I was 130 beats per minute just the entire time, right? So uh, it's goals, right? Like what are your goals? And
Mm,
I have a diverse array of workouts. They have different effects, and I've learned what those are. Also, that
yeah.
you cannot out exercise bad food. I knew that already, but it just shows in the data. I mean, there
Mm,
was one time where, I mean, I should show you the roller coaster, right? It's like I was tracking it with a CGM. I had the pancakes. My blood sugar went up. I did a bit of a workout, like a small workout. It came down, kept going up. And I have like these three bumps because it's just like me trying to fight it, and then eventually just being like, I need to be dead for 3 hours, and so take the pain at some point.
you can't out eat a bad diet. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fascinating the whole training, staying out of the grey zone of training, like you said, in that middle zone between aerobic and anaerobic, and it's really good to build muscles and be really intense, but that is going to boost your blood sugar, but that light activity where you can still talk, you can still breathe is really important and useful. And I think there's sort of like I talk about fat and carbs at the same time as this amazing combination that makes you overeat. And I think there's sort of a similar sort of thing in a way that when you're in that gray zone in the middle, that you end up having this amazing appetite. Your body it burns fat and carbs, sort of tries to burn both at the same time. It doesn't quite work for our purposes. I don't know. I haven't quite worked that out in my head, but I think there's something similar there. Everything I see is like mixing saturated fat and unsaturated fat is the lowest satiety outcome of mixing fat and carbs together at the same time. And I think you're either walking gently and having a light activity workout, or you're just blasting it. And you don't just want to be in the middle in that gray zone of no
Which is
man's
it's
land.
actually uncomfortable too, that zone. Like
Mm,
it actually you sort of don't feel that good, I've found, for
mm,
whatever reason. If you're in touch with, I mean, for
mm,
whatever reason, that's when I need more electrolytes and stuff. I mean, if I were to say one thing data teaches you around your health is things aren't linear, right?
mm,
Like you talk about protein, right?
mm,
Like protein percentage, carb percentages, exercise intensities. We all want to think more is better
mm,
because in most of our life, things are linear, right? Like
mm.
if you're earning X dollars an hour and you work more hours, you make more money. But it's kind of like as you increase the intensity of your exercise, it doesn't necessarily get better. And actually, a blog article coming out about this. the guy who invented high intensity training, or I shouldn't say invented, who's sort of known for it, is a guy named Casey Viator. He died at like 62 of a heart attack. And there's also a lot of data that shows that really, like, people who do a ton of endurance training their death rates increase because it's damaging the heart. And so I think all of us have to constantly be getting comfortable with non-linearity of outcomes, whether that's, exercise or, diet, especially in the health thing. Like the extremes, we just have to think about it. It can be curved, it can be linear, but that's why data is so important, and understanding the data, and again, without getting overwhelmed by it. Right.
And also periodization, where you go for a while, you're trying to build fitness, or you're trying to lose weight, one thing at a time. You got one goal at a time. Then you take a break, take a rest, catch up on yourself, and then go again. Back to the Bridgewater Ray Dalio days. Yeah. I love the Principles book, and he talks about making every decision off data and idea meritocracy. And I thought, that sounds like utopia. Why doesn't the whole world work like that? That Ray himself doesn't have complete authoritarian power. Everybody's got an idea, and based on the data and based on, votes based on the data, they can make a decision together. And based on that data-driven decision-making, they've become the biggest hedge fund in the world with $100 billion under management. And you've talked about confirmation bias and how our whole world is so. We're in this Twitter group or this Facebook group, and we all see the world the same way because we all get the same crazy social media feed that confirms our bias. And the same thing happens in nutrition, as this group of people see the world in a completely polar opposite way to the other group of people, and they both work if they stick at that extremes. You've got the carnivores who are completely convinced of their approach, and then you've got the plant-based vegans who also look reasonably healthy at the other extreme. And how can we use data to unwind our world and understand it better and take out the confirmation bias when there's so much confirmation bias in our social media feed, and our everything's optimized for our unique bubble that we live in, that we feel comfortable in, and we never get challenged?
Yeah. So I think about this a lot, because I think if you combine confirmation bias with the fact that we do a lot of things and explain things to ourselves in a way that makes us feel good rather than what's truthful, right? So between ego and confirmation bias, I believe that covers most of what's wrong with all
the world,
including myself, right? Like, what's funny is I know all these things and I read about all these things, but I suffer from that. Like, knowing it is not a solution. Like, it's actually very difficult. And so I struggle with the question, right? And, I think a little bit of it is always seeking to disprove yourself, right? Like, so in the US, we have, at one extreme, we have Fox News, which is a very, right-wing media organization. At the other extreme, we have, let's say, an MSNBC. I mean, they're more extreme than that, but in the major networks, right? And so I just have on my dial in my car, I have both of those stations, right? And to the extent I care about an issue, I make sure I've listened to both sides, right? That's a small thing, but I actually find it kind of helpful. And so I think rather than reading the things that are on the same blogs we're on, like, just seek to disprove whatever it is you believe. Like, if you're into keto, read like Big Fat Keto Lies. Maybe, you know what I mean? Which is your book. Like, maybe you'll buy into some of it. Maybe you won't buy into other pieces of it, but at least hear that and look at the data they're presenting. Because one of the problems with data, right, is, I like to say, if you torture data long enough, it'll give you the answer you want.
Yeah.
And so totally. So let's use the data, but how do we be impartial about it? And it's like, these are hard questions, because I think it's very unnatural, right? Like, we want to be part of a tribe. Like, it feels way better to listen to things that agree with us. Like, doesn't that feel great? Like, I'm right. That feels good. So I don't have an answer. I have little things that I've incorporated in my day, but, or like in my parenting, right? Like, one of the things my kids will always do, like, hey, what will you do next time? I said, what's your next time statement, right? Like this happened, we had a bad outcome. What will you do differently next time? And of course, the very first thing is, well, next time he won't take my toy, right? Like, no, what will you do differently next time? And so I think like when we reflect on something bad happening, the only person we can control is ourselves, right? And so there's a little bit, that's one thing I think Ray Dalio, that was sort of a key insight of his, is that like going off data is uncomfortable because you're constantly having to admit you're wrong. And so one thing I tell my kids, I say, how often is dad wrong? All day, every day, right? Like, and by the way, it's okay to be wrong. And I have to give Silicon Valley credit for accepting failure. Like this is a place where failing at 4 startups doesn't hurt your resume, right? And I think there's a real value to that. So if I were to add one other nugget, it would be okay being wrong and be okay to change your mind. Like you can believe something different today than you did yesterday. That is not threatening. Like I think Keynes said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do? Right? Like, yeah, sometimes you're going to be wrong. And so I think the beauty of, we talked about closing the circle, how does data-driven fasting fit into Silicon Valley is, look, there are some new ideas here and there are some controversial ideas, right? And I think that if people can sort of table some of this keto mindset, which is very dominant here, right? And maybe at least be open to it. Like you don't have to look, it may not work for you, right? Like I still think a lot of nutrition is individualized and, maybe it's harder if you're a vegan and whatever, like, there are little details, but at least expose yourself to it. Like at least read Big Fat Keto Lies and see what you think, see what you think, then talk to me. Right? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll tell you,
I think it's all about, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, like, and also ask your intuition, right? Like, so does it really seem to make sense to you that bacon would be healthy and blueberries would not? Like, I don't know, maybe. Doesn't, like, maybe. So it's like at least ask that question. Like maybe you'll conclude blueberries are bad, but you might not.
Yeah. I love how you've sort of brought the data and the psychology and the self-reflection and into sort of a spiritual realm of reflecting on your own hunger and your own journey. And I was going to say, a lot of talking before the call about I dabbled in trading, nothing like Bridgewater Capital, but all the things I learned from backtesting and analyzing stock market data, I've tried to apply pretty much those same philosophy and principles of what I learned back then in an engineering sense on nutrition and insulin and diabetes. And it's completely fascinating to try and bring it back and see what are the major factors that make carnivore work or vegan work or plant-based work or keto work. What's the fundamental principles behind all those sort of things? So the whole, you were talking before about the plant-based drive in parallel to the keto drive, and it's interesting all the different factions of diets, and even people who are very data-driven and highly educated, they nearly apply godlike deities to diets that aren't deities, they're diets.
Diet is religion.
Diet has become the new religion.
It really is. Like we're not allowed to talk about religion anymore, and people really aren't that religious anymore. But your diet philosophy, it's like a very defining thing because it can describe, like, if you're a vegan, like that, a lot comes with that, right? If you're a carnivore, like a lot is said by it, and it's almost like, I live in a very health conscious neighborhood, right? Like, and it's just something people talk about. By the way, being an engineer is one of the best things you can do to avoid confirmation bias, by the way. Like I love working with engineers because they do start with data, right? Like, and that's one of your strengths, I think, is allow yourself to be surprised by what you see, right? Like be willing to be surprised. Like I would say it's kind of surprising that your 11% protein rule, like that was kind of surprising to me. I don't know, but then I tried it and I'm like, does it work? And I was probably doing 7% and now I do 11 and I feel better. I don't know. Pretty good.
I love
right?
that you
Like
found
that's
the article.
surprising.
Must have been 3 years ago that I started diving into all that data to
Yeah,
see protein and satiety and front loading protein. It's like, oh, that's really interesting. I'll write about it.
yeah,
And Chris
yeah.
finds it and ends up on the blog. So in terms of doing one thing at a time, like our world is
Mhm.
so, that's one thing I've been battling with is there's so many things you can do and so many things you can do with your time and so many apps and so many things on social media to keep up with and so many obligations. You just get to the point of overwhelm and do nothing well, and you
Mhm.
don't feel satisfied with that. I mean, you've really backed out of that from being Harvard, Stanford, Bridgewater, hedge
Mhm.
fund. What have you learned about just doing one thing well at a time?
Yeah.
It's probably another 3 hour chat.
Yeah. So I would say the main thing I've learned is to ask myself what I am excited about. Okay. Um, because on any given day, there are a million things I could do.
Mm,
Uh, and then as soon as I find myself using the word should,
mm,
that's always a little trigger like, oh, I should call that broker back about
mm,
that deal. Like that word should is a big flag for
mm,
me. It always perks my ears, So um, how do I sort through it? I definitely ask myself what I'm excited about.
mm,
Another factor is, what what actually will have a lot of impact, right? So I'm really focused on like what is there's a guy named Kay. He writes a blog called Rad Reads. I really like him. I'm actually very friendly with him.
cool.
Surfer, lovely guy. But he talks about this idea of like 10x,
Mm,
like or and then $10,000 an hour work.
mm,
Like, where's that $10,000 an hour work, and how do you expand that part of your pie? Like, so checking email may not be that, but what
mm,
is that like one point of leverage? And so I find myself often asking like, because in a way, as an entrepreneur, I eat what I kill, right? Like
mm,
I'm not really paid. I have in the thousands of hours per year, 95% of them aren't that productive, but
mm,
5% of them are really productive. And so I'm constantly trying to grow what that is without really knowing because some of it is so experimental. So what am I excited
mm,
about? And then what do I believe will have the most kind of leverage in terms of the things that I'm skilled at and that will get the highest outcome, right? So it might be a redesign of a product. It could be anything.
mm.
Um, but I'll tell you, if I'm not excited about it, that probably gets assigned to somebody else.
Yeah.
But if I'm excited about it and it's a great point of leverage, then I do that. But yeah, I kind of wing it most days. I don't like having those, I've and I've just admit again, some of you admit to yourself, like I sort of wish that I could be like a classic CEO of a company or something, but it's just not who I am. I'm not someone who
Mm,
wants to manage the day to day. You know, I don't do well with people issues. Like you got to just admit these things to yourself and
mm.
then structure your life accordingly.
Yeah. Do
And
what
I've
you
been
do
lucky to have
well
some
and
flexibility.
yeah, try to find the intersection of what you do well, you have a unique skill and there's a need for in the world and just niche down on that and try to clean out everything else that's not
Yeah.
useful and beneficial and not going to help you get towards that one end goal that you want.
I find if you're doing things you love that you're good at
Mm,
and you have passion for and that connect to your bigger purpose, like it kind of works out.
mm.
I don't know how it works out, but I just find it does.
Yeah,
In my experience, you
no,
know,
totally.
I'm sure there are examples where it doesn't, but it's just like in general, if you're kind of, and then you're surrounding yourself with people who are, living how you want to live, it
Mm.
just seems to play out.
The right people come along at the right time to complete it.
The universe
This has
meets you
been,
halfway. Yeah.
yeah, this has been a really fun chat. Anything else you want thoughts to leave people with
Oh,
in the
geez. Well,
world?
we had such a long list of things. I'm trying to think. Did we miss anything on our? I'm sure we
I
missed a
think we
million.
hit most of the cool ones.
Yeah.
Other than the vegan diet and how to
Oh, yeah.
optimize
No,
that
it
for
just, I think just there's a trend towards veganism that I think has a lot of benefit to it.
mm,
And I think there can be a bit of a struggle at getting enough protein
mm,
while being a vegan. Um, I don't really have a great reflection on it, except to say there there's a lot more protein. If you net out the fiber, there's a lot more protein in a
mm,
lot of plant-based foods than you think. But realistically, if you want to be a vegan and, have the optimum protein percentage for feeling full, you probably need to do a little bit of supplementation with vegan protein powder or something like that. But I think it's possible. It's just a bit of a challenge to eat that high protein. So not much to add there, except I think it's a great thing for society if we can get there. I just think there are other trade-offs we have to be thinking about in terms of how we're doing, and are we now eating something that is nominally vegan, but really is a bunch of plant pieces pulled apart and reformulated in a lab and cooked, and they come out looking vegan, but they're really not, and they're doing all kinds of bad things to you, and it's really alien food. And so I just think, it's hard for me to be black and white about it. Like I try to, as I mentioned to you, I try to just add those higher protein vegetable items in, but I still do eat meat, and meat has a place in what I do, but try not to make it all about meat. Just that's my personal preference. I mean, there are carnivore diet people who love it. For me, I'm just trying to back off the amount of meat, and I think it's doable, but it's one of these restrictions I'm working with and just trying to figure out how to balance things correctly. But look, I thank you for the program, Marty. As I've told you, I think you don't toot your own horn enough, so I'll keep trying to find ways to do it for you.
Thanks,
but there's a reason this went from, and I don't know the numbers, I'm going to make them up, but order of magnitude, right? Like there's a reason why this has gone from 12 people to 1,200 people, and I think you're going to be at 12,000 pretty soon here. And you're going to start breaking Facebook, because there is a magic to this. And sometimes the craziest things, the things that sound the craziest, are actually the most sensible. And as crazy as it sounds to prick your finger, right, to figure out whether you're hungry, it actually is the one way you can maybe finally solve this problem. And I think that's what I see, is that the hope in the Facebook group of people saying, like, you know what, I got it now. I got it now. And this isn't a diet. It's like, it feels sustainable. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. So you're bringing a lot to the world. And I think that this will, the rocket has just left Earth's orbit, and we're about to hit peak velocity. So I'm happy to be part of the journey with you.
Thanks, man. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great night with your family.
Thank you. I will. Yeah, we're going to go watch Megalon. All right. Have a good one. Thanks.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.